Welcome to the Intermetrics Disk and Values Index Trading Supplement. Today we're talking about the Disk Index and the Values Index. It's just basically understanding the why and the how behind why we do what we do. So we're going to start with disk. These aspects of ourselves when it comes to understanding disk, and we'll explain more about that in just a second, have a couple of basic truths. The way we behave as measured by the disk theory, these are steady traits. They're what we call glacially dynamic. So while I don't like to say that they're carved in stone and they never change, by the time we're in our late teens, they're pretty well set. Glacially dynamic indicates that they move but very slowly. So 5, 10, 15 years, you definitely can see migration, and what your style used to be may not be at all the same. It all depends on life experience and circumstance. But we can know with certainty that the style of a person's behavior, their preferred behavioral style, is pretty fixed, and it's not likely to change anytime too soon. Their behavioral style is also foundational, so it's formed very early on, and it underlies, moving to the next bullet as well, it underlies everything that we do when it comes to behaving in the world around us. It's pervasive as well. So there's not anything that we interact with, communicate to, prefer to be communicated from, that's not influenced by the behavioral preferences as measured in disk theory. They're unique, with 40,000 plus possible combinations. Not anybody you really bump into is likely to have the exact same preferred behavioral style that you do. So they're singular to who we are. And they're hidden. While we may see somebody's behavior, they're not easily observable. Even a very well-trained expert in behavior can have trouble picking up exactly which behaviors are driving the actions that they're seeing made manifest in reality. Now, we use a theory called DISC. It was created by Dr. William Marston up at Harvard. He started his research all the way back around 1928, and it measures our preferred behavioral style, or how we prefer to do things. Actions, tasks, behaviors, things like that. What Dr. Marston did, which was pretty groundbreaking at the time, backstory there, most of the research into people or psychology was done on the psychologically ill, or people that were not performing normally, and he decided to study normal people. One of the first to do that, really, at least empirically, and started with his book, Emotions of Normal People. He realized that there were two different themes with polar opposites that he could be looking at. Somebody on the extroversion-introversion scale could be either high or low or somewhere in between. But then there was also this favorable-unfavorable aspect. Do I see the world in a more open way as a favorable, safe place? Or am I a little bit more reserved to a lot more reserved, and it's a more unfavorable place? Maybe I'm going to hold off a little and be more closed versus open on the opposite end of the scale. When he put these two across each other at 90 degrees, he ended up finding there were 4 quadrants, and there's core behaviors that all of us exhibit in each of these 4 quadrants. So we may say in the training, we may end up talking casually live in person, he's a high D, she's a high S. We have a score in all 4 of these, and we'll reinforce that here in a little while. But that's where the 4 quadrants come from. You have the D, which is on the left and upper left-hand quadrant, so they're more active, extroverted, outgoing, but with a bit of a closed orientation to the world. They tend to focus more on tasks than the social side of it. The I, well, it's still as extroverted, still as outgoing as the D, but more open, but more of a social focus. Moving down and to the right in the lower right-hand quadrant, the S, we'll learn what all these mean in just a sec. The S is favorable towards the social focus, but more guarded, more the introverted. So it's the I, but without the extroversion. And then moving across lastly to the lower left-hand column, you have the C. More like the D as far as the unfavorable orientation, the task orientation, basically a little more closed or guarded, but like the S, more the introvert, more passive than active and extroverted. When you put these 4 together, this is what appears in the actual report. These are the layman's terms that we use. We try not to get into too much psychology or theory. Fancy psychobabble scares people off and doesn't do any good. So instead of going through any of that in the report, here's the first example you'll see in any DISC index profile of these 4 different categories. D, I, S, and C all represent the letters or the words that he used to quantify these 4: decisive, interactive, stabilizing, and cautious. I like the second row best because it helps us understand and reinforce that we have a score in all 4 of these. They don't measure the same thing. So D really looks at how we tend to deal with problems or approach problems, and it's the speed with which we might make that decision. So the higher the D score goes, the more demanding, driving, forceful. The lower the D score goes, the less decisive, the more mild, conservative, agreeable, unobtrusive. Now, these 12 words underneath each of these columns aren't the entirety of the scale. We could probably fit about 150 words to describe the distance between high and low. So we don't want anybody to think, well, this is it. I'm going to be one of these words depending on where on this spectrum I fall high to low. This is just to give an example of the type of changes in demeanor and behavior that happen when you move from the top to the bottom. Notice, however, the I. So you have the D. The D ends up dealing with the decisiveness, but then the I isn't about problems and decisiveness. It's about how you tend to interact with others or share your opinions. The higher the I goes, the more extroverted, the more outgoing, gregarious, persuasive, enthusiastic, inspiring, and every one of these is the inverse. The lower the I score goes for any individual, the less interactive, the more introverted, less extroverted. They're more reflective, they're more matter-of-fact, more withdrawn. Extreme examples of low scores could be seen as aloof. The pace. Stabilizing has to do with the pace. Again, nothing to do with how you interact with people per se, nothing to do with decisiveness or speed of decisions. It's about pace. So I'm reinforcing we need to understand the score in all 4 because it would be a big mistake to just simply analyze somebody and say, hi D, I understand all I need to know. You don't understand all you need to know unless you know what their score is in all 4. High stabilizers, this is how you prefer to pace things in your environment. Here it flips a little bit. The higher the score in S goes, the more predictable you like in an environment, the more patient you want to be, the more passive, the slower you are to change, more resistant to change. The lower the S, the exact opposite. Again, like I said, everything is an inverse here, high to low. So the lower the score in the S goes, the more restless you are, the more active you are, the more spontaneity you enjoy, the more impetuous. Your pace is very fast. You want to go, go, go. Lastly, the high C. Having nothing to do with the previous 3 dimensions, this one stands alone by understanding your preference for procedures, how cautious you tend to be, where you are with regards to appreciation for protocols and standards and adherence to them and needing of them. The higher the C goes, the more you need them, the more perfectionistic, analytical, systemic, cautious, careful you become. The lower the C goes, the less analytical, the less cautious. In other words, more independent, rebellious, careless to define some with regards to detail and planning, or even defiant. The key to remember, again, is that we have a score in all 4, and we really need to understand all 4 of these scores. You have a very shallow understanding if you just look at one. So let's use some comical examples of each of these 4. If you have somebody, and we'll just imagine that they're the highest score in each of these 4, a caricature, if you will, that might represent the highest D would be Bill Bottom Line. So imagine you're sitting across the table, and what you would see in a person who had nothing but a high D, everything else was low, is Bill Bottom Line. He's to the point, big on multitasking, quick, 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 let's go. Very demanding of himself, you, everybody around him. Tends to be pretty aggressive, assertive, competitive. Let's say, however, you found somebody who had low scores in everything except a high I. Well, Joe Bag of Donuts would represent that person. Okay? Disorganized, yes, they have a low C. Enjoying life, all about socializing, very carefree, very emotive. Okay? When it comes to being emotional, the high I's are the most emotional. If they have a thought, they share it. If they have a feeling, you know it. If everything else was low except just the high S, then you'd have steady Eddie. Relaxed, laid back, friendly, easygoing, very sociable. Okay, not in the interactive way, in the very warm, open, caring way. He's very steady. Again, stability is the name of the area, so they like lots of stability. Don't rock my boat. I don't like a lot of antagonism. I don't like a lot of stress. And lastly, if everything was low and all the person had was a high C, which is very rare that any one of these, that's why we can poke fun at these caricatures, because it's very rare to find somebody who has only one high score and everything else is very low. But if we did, just for learning purposes, you would deal with Tom technical, super high analytical, all about rules like dress codes, all about accuracy. Okay, got my double calculators. I've got pens and papers and rule books and binders and filing cabinets. High C's are very unemotional. Okay? This does not compute. Okay, things like Spock in Star Trek, very rational. No room for emotions. Has to be quantifiable if we're going to deal with it. Always focused on return on investment and proof. All of those facts. So let's contrast four of these four together under things. The first title we'll examine is preferences. So what do these each prefer? If they're a high D, back to Bill Bottom Line, they prefer things like authority, prestige, they want versatility, they don't like repetitive tasks, they want opportunities for growth. Big picture folks, all about bottom line approaches. They like direct answers, get straight to the point. Remember, they were on the side of the C when it comes to task orientation. But they're on the open side or the extroverted side, so don't give me too much details. Love being in charge, love expressing opinions because they're on the top of that circle, if you remember, where they're outgoing and extroverted. High I's, and this is in the same format almost. High I's, still outgoing, still extroverted, but more open, so they prefer social recognition. They love being popular. They love having people to talk to. This category is titled the interactive. You cannot interact all by yourself. You can, but people will look at you weird. They prefer favorable working conditions. They love to be recognized because that's a form of interaction. It's a reinforcement that others are interacting and seeing them. They love motivating and working with other people. Yet again, a reason to interact. Opportunities to verbalize their thoughts, social interactions, participative relations. Get the point? The high C's, however, prefer personal independence. Think back like to the D's. They like to take their time and have tons of detail. Changes that are well planned with explicit details are okay for a high C, but somewhat averse to risk unless it's well proven. So you have to factually show the data to the high C's. Very exacting work. This could actually have very inserted in there. Okay? Love instructions, processes, rules exist, let's follow them or create them. They want plenty of time. They don't like being rushed because they have way too much detail to make sure, too many I's to dot and T's to cross. So lots of facts, data, these are what they prefer. And the high S's prefer security and stability. That's the name of the category. S for stability, stabilizers. They like consistency, which creates stability. They like ample time to adjust like the C's, but that's because they're risk averse, because risk is unstable. It's not the same old mantra. They like to be accepted as part of a group because, like the high I's, they're on the social side. Okay, but they like to specialize more than anything. The S's probably tend to be more specialized than anybody else. Why? Because they don't like change. They like repetition. They like the routine. They like knowing what they're doing, and becoming a specialist means they get very deep into exactly what they do, and they do a lot of it. Very sincere, very personable as far as getting along with groups. Again, they don't like rocking the boats, and they really prefer to minimize risk. When it comes to communicating, so when you're communicating to them, that is, and this will pretty much be seen mirrored back, with a D, you have to be very clear, specific, and to the point. Don't get too fluffy. Don't get too detailed. Don't be all mushy. Stick to business. Be predetermined with what you're going to say. Don't say, well, I don't know, let me vacillate back and forth and hem-haw. And quick. This is the decisive dimension. They want the answer now. They want the big picture answer as well, not the small detailed. Okay? They want top line, 30,000 foot. Minutia slows them down, and they can't work decisively with way too much detail. And you got to be confident when you're communicating with a high D. Don't be wishy-washy. Communicating to a high I is different because they're very much the opposite, because the open versus closed approach, you need to communicate with them in a much more emotional way, much more social. Okay, relate to them. Walk into a room and start talking about the fishing pictures on the wall with a high D, and they're going to say, yeah, why are you here? Don't do that with the high I, and they're going to feel a little, void. They want to socialize. They see you as an opportunity to interact. So let them interact. Draw them into interaction. Ask for their opinions. And take a pretty casual approach, whereas with the high Ds, it's much more professional. C's, when you're communicating with a high C, most of all, be factual. You must prepare in advance with sufficient data and facts. You can't communicate effectively with a C with unknowns and possibly A, B, or C could happen, or I'm not sure, but what if? You need to have definitive, siloed, it's A, and this is what we would do, B, this is what we would do. That's it. Done. Pick. Support all the statements you make when you're talking to a high C. Okay, you can't give too many opinion statements. They need to be factual statements, and you should be ready to show that fact with proof. They're not like scientists. You tell them that it ended up meaning it was 95% correct, and they're going to say, great, show me what you looked at to determine that. I want to decide for myself. Your discussions shouldn't meander. They should be very organized. Okay, it doesn't hurt to have a bullet list in your head, at least, if you're talking, if not on paper, about the discussion points you're going to have when you sit down with a high C. They like agendas, and they like sticking to the agendas. I've had high Cs that have, in a training program in Europe, said we're going to take a 10-minute break, and at 10 minutes they locked the door. If you weren't back from coffee and in your seat, you weren't where you're supposed to be, and they don't tolerate breaking of rules. You can list out the pros and cons of any decision in a much more effective way to communicate because you're covering something much more exhaustively than just giving the opinion of, here's why it's good. And you must give them, again, solid, tangible, and practical evidence. Now, in your training manual, the DISC and Values training manual, you have these lists as well, and we won't go into every one of these, but it's good to go reference this to just give you some more words. The column with the high D, all of those words apply to a high D. There is no hierarchy here. Inquisitive on the bottom of the first column under high D is not any less accurate to a high D than is the top word of demanding. It simply is just a list, no order to it. Same is true. Low D, all of the words under low D represent a typically low D. So let's imagine it's a 0 to 100 scale, high being somewhere in the 80 to 100 range, low being in somewhere to 20 and below. So you can look through these characteristics. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read every single word, but it gives you the understanding of these are the traits that you will see in behaviors of people that are either high or low, D, I, S, or C. And lastly, I think one of the more important tables to look at when it comes to the reason we use these, which is in consulting or managing or leading or hiring somebody based on their behaviors. In other words, all of that goes under the broader umbrella of understanding, effectively and accurately understanding an individual to make decisions about them and hiring and so on and so forth. The possible limitations one to me is very important because this is what happens when you have too high a score. Maybe you're getting closer up into the 90 and above range. And the limitations we're talking about are as a result of too high, too much of a good thing. All four of these are equally as good. There's no one dimension that's better than the other, out of any context of role that is. But too much of a good thing can still be a problem in almost any role. So a 99D has a problem sometimes with overstepping authority or boundaries, and I'm being polite by adding sometimes. They almost always do. 99 to 100 Ds can usually act way too impulsively. They're creatures of gut instinct. Which way should we go? Left. There was no thought behind it. It was just decide. Okay? They can create anxiety in others. This much assertive, aggressive, decisive, overpowering sharing and thoughts of opinions in a very dominant, decisive way, unless you're in the room with another 99D, can create anxiety, especially in high S or a high C. They're likely to be overly blunt because they're closed off a little. They tend to be blunt and frank in their comments. They don't think in an emotional way. They just think factually, hey, here's what I think. And because of the level of decisiveness, they don't stop the thought coming from their brain, exiting their mouth. It usually just goes out. So these two bullets kind of tie together, the fourth and the fifth. They can be overly blunt or frank in their comments, and that can lead people to feel they're being too critical or fault-finding. They're very inattentive to details, so asking 100% D to make sure and check for typos in this document or check the financial records, they're not good at it at all. They don't enjoy it, but more than lack of enjoyment, they're not good at it, so they're going to miss all the typos or all the inaccuracies. Too high, you'll get very bored with routine. I mean, every job's going to have a certain amount of consistency and routine, and 100% D, even a 90 and above, that's going to be very difficult for them, probably to their detriment. And they dislike being led or having to be followed because they're so assertive, so aggressive, so dominant. D can also represent dominant, that they don't like being dominated. Limitations of a high I are that they can be overly concerned with social image or popularity. They may make decisions that are not the most rational decision for any reason other than the fact that it's likely to, make somebody else appreciate them or like them. So sometimes they have problems confronting poor performance issues. Sometimes they may tell somebody something just to make sure that they're being liked and they're having a good relationship when that wasn't the right thing to say. Because of how prolific they are at sharing thoughts, other lower I's can feel as if they're overselling their ideas. Now, mix this with a high D, and then you really have a very aggressive, assertive person who's socially sharing all of their ideas. But just the I itself, getting into that 90 range and above, can't shut up and can't stop talking about why they think something's a great idea or what they think about anything anyway, period, good or bad. So they'll talk too much instead of listening enough. Very impulsive, sort of like the high Ds. They can be very inconsistent. As I said in the first bullet, they're likely to overvalue others. And like the Ds, they're not good with details or accuracy, and they can be very superficial in their analysis. They skim the surface 30,000 feet. Cs, too high a C, 90 and above, they can easily require too much detail. This is wonderful when you're working in the nuclear power plant, or a pharmacist. 0.5, 5.0 milligrams, it doesn't matter, just give them the medication. That's a bad thing when you're dealing in some very specific roles. But more often than not, they might come across with a very high C as a little anal retentive, too perfectionistic. They can become, as a result, paralyzed by lack of data. And everybody likes a certain amount of data, but the threshold, the requirement, the bar to be met when it comes to the amount of data that a 99 or a 100C wants is usually unrealistically high for almost any scenario. Because of their requirements of accuracy and proof, they're not very decisive. And it's not to say they can't make a decision, it's because they prefer to make that decision only after they have all the answers they can think of. So they can also be considered at the same time, because they're not making decisions looking for too much analysis and data, getting bogged down in that minutia. They become threatened easily if they don't get that data. You push the 100C for a decision now, and they have 4 out of 10 answers, they will get very threatened. They put a lot of personal credence in being accurate and doing the right thing. As a result, conversely, they'll become dogmatic and rigid when they have that idea. They spend enough time looking at the data, analyzing the results, and making the decision so carefully that if you argue with them and tell them we need to leave that decision, leave that direction, change the way we're doing it and what you decided, they're not going to go easily. They've done a lot of work to establish that stake in the ground. They didn't just willy-nilly stick it there and they can easily pick it up. They've buried it 3 feet down in a big bar of concrete. They lose sight of the big picture, sort of like getting bogged down, and too much of a high C requires too much explanation for most everybody else. They'll ask 20 questions, and around question 5 or 6, the vast majority of everybody else who doesn't have a 100C is sick of it. They can't stand anymore. And then too much of the high S, too much in the stabilizing realm, they strive too hard to maintain that status quo. Sometimes things need to move, sometimes it needs to change, very often. And they will resist that change. Even with practical evidence that argues rationally, we need to change location, change direction, do something differently. It's not the practical result that they're seeing, it's the fact that they're changing the way it has been done. Like the C, they'll delay too long in making decisions, probably longer than any of the other 3. And because we talk about specialization, they're not great big picture innovators. They like getting into the routine and doing the same thing. Innovation requires leaping without having an idea where you're going to go, just stepping off outside of the box. They like being in the box. Again, this is the 90 to above S. Too much. Okay? They can become too content with the way things are. Irrational practical results showing them, but they like the fact that they know what they're doing, even if it's not the most effective way to do it. Tend to be reactive instead of proactive, and they adjust very slowly to rapid change. They'll actually shut down with rapid change. So they always want to seek to preserve way too much stability when they get that high. Carrying along with the caricatures here, the high Ds have very high ego strength, and usually it's overinflated. They usually bite off more they can chew. They're big risk takers. Of the four, the higher the D goes, the greater the acceptance of risk is. They like it. They prefer it. They're the most impatient of all the four. So the highest D in your person's profile, they're going to be impatient, and the higher it goes, the worse they are. Versus the highest being the I, they love standing out. They love individuality. They love being unique. They love unique messages, just because it's unique. They love turning off the beaten path because they are innovators. The D's and the I's are more the beginners and starters. The S's and the C's are more the closers and finishers. So the D's and here the I's, they love innovating. They may go in the wrong direction. They didn't plan it out. They may not have thought it through, but they decided to just get a wild hair and crank the steering wheel left. Let's go. The S's are the most supportive and collaborative. If you have the highest S, you have the most sincere. You have the most interested in helping. Okay? You have the person who's usually almost always the steadfast anchor of the team. Okay? They're that sea anchor. They're the ones that are constantly holding everything back, okay? Sometimes to their detriment, but they're creating stability. And the C's, the most scholarly, the ones who want the most data, the ones who are the most analytical, want the most knowledge. They're very black and white. There's no gray zone. It's an outhouse. It's a hole in the ground. How can it not be working? Nope. Rules are rules. Here's some steps that lead down to a beach in South Australia, and took this picture while I was there, and the sign says out of order. They don't have a practical result sometimes. They're concrete steps. How can they possibly be out of order? Now, obviously they didn't want people going down to the beach, but they take impractical rule following to the highest degree. So let's understand these four when it comes to innovation. Talked briefly about it, but the highest innovators are the D's, okay? Even more than the I's. They're the ones who will just create constantly. Side effect is sometimes that they start way too many things, never finish any of them, if one possibly. Early adopters, so there's the innovation, the real tip of the spear, but then there's early adopters. Adopting, obviously, it's been innovated, now I'm going to adopt it. D's and I's, depending on the score, maybe the D goes a little lower than their early adopters, and the I's will jump in here. Early majority, so now enough people have adopted, this thing I'm selling is brand new. D's are likely my best target. It's newer, D's and I's are likely a better target. It's new, but it's been out long enough where I'm starting to see an early majority of people start to switch to using this brand, this product, this solution. I's and S's. I's like that majority. That really pulls them in because they're socializers and they like people, and wherever the more people go, the better. And the S's start to show up here in the adoption curve because they like stability. And if the majority is going someplace, I like being with the majority. Late majority, lower S's and C's, and if there's any non-adopters in this group, it's likely the C. Okay? You have the highest burden to prove changing, adopting, adapting the way you do things is going to make sense. Many times the C may be just the absolute holdout that you can never convince because you can never match their burden of proof. If you put these all together, similar to what Marston did, you can look at them as faster, slower, closed, or open. So really horizontally, closed to open, you're talking about degree of connection. And then vertically, faster to slower, you're talking about my time to persuade them, the persuasion cycle. Top two, D and I, faster in being able to be persuaded. S and C on the bottom, much slower. Left and right, D's and C's, less connection. On the right, I's and S's, more connection because they're open. So you really could look at this as upper left-hand quadrant, D's are probably one of the easiest sales. This is a tricky word. It's a slippery slope, I know, but there's a lot of reasons why any sale could be difficult. But given the degree of connection I have to create with them personally, build a rapport and socialize, and given how fast I can persuade and they'll make decisions, the D's the fastest. The I becomes second fastest. It increases over D because I have to connect more than I did with the D. So now I have to spend a little more time socializing and talking, even in a cell phone sale. D's I can make in 5 minutes. I need to socialize and talk and hang out with an I for 10 or 15 minutes. But they're also fast on the persuasion cycle. Moving over to the S's, or down to the S's, still open. I still have to develop even more connection with the S, actually, but they're slower to make the decision. So third fastest, or less complicated sale. I need to put effort in for the D and then the I and then the S, and the most effort goes into the C. They're the slow persuasion side. They're slow to make decisions. And even though they require less connection, they're closed, and the amount of information they need is such that it takes the longest, and they tend to be the most effort in any sale. It's population US based only we're looking at here. This is the stats. Depending on a couple of different studies, they range anywhere from the high D's in the 10 to 15% of the population in the United States, high I's 25 to 35%, S's 45 to 50, and C's 20 to 30%. So the odds are, if you stop any person on the street and end up talking to them, you're most likely talking to a high S. I is next, C is last, and the smallest percentage of the population you're likely to run into would be the high D's. DISC is unique and interesting because we have these 4 styles, and we're going to show you an image here in just a minute, and you'll see how they're presented in the report. And you saw this in training. And you have 4 columns, 4 graphs, bar graphs for D, I, S, and C, and their level of score in each. But you can adapt. So in your report, you'll have seen a natural behavioral style, a score for D, I, S, and C. And then there's 4 other bar graphs on the bottom right-hand corner of the page that show the exact same graphs for D, I, S, and C with different scores, most likely. DISC is interesting because it's the closest to the surface. It's above Freudian's conscious line in that I can see somewhat, not completely, but I can get a sense for my behavior. Others can point it out to me, and I can be aware of it and notice it. Because I can notice it, I can therefore try to influence it. So we get 2 different sets of 4 when it comes to DISC. The natural, which is where I go and how I behave when I'm not thinking about it, and the adapted, which is how I try to modify that behavior when I am aware of it, when I'm thinking about it consciously. So natural would be more subconscious, adapted would be more conscious. Natural happens without effort, when I'm not thinking, and one of the times when I'm not thinking is when I'm stressed. I stop thinking about what I'm doing when I become angry or stressed or moving too quickly. And I can slow down and consciously pay attention when I'm not stressed, when I'm not angry, and try to adapt my behavior. So each dimension can adapt. These adaptations or adaptations come from my perception of the results that I get based on the behaviors that I exhibit. So they're overt and covert. You know, my feedback. I can get overt feedback from my manager who says, you are way too talkative, way too aggressive, nowhere near enough detailed. You know, you're very sloppy in your presentations, disorganized. They're just, somebody's telling me that multiple times maybe, or multiple people. Or they can be covert. Nobody blatantly says the literal phrase, you are too much of this, or you're doing not enough of that. But I watch how others are behaving, and I see their performance compared to my own results, and I go, wow, you know, they're a lot more outgoing than I am. Well, Mary delivered a 5-page numbered hierarchy of reports and data, and I kind of jotted it down on a She's a lot more detailed than I am. She's much more accurate, much more precise. He takes a lot longer to make the decision than I do, and his decisions seem to be better. So being aware of these things, I adapt my behavior, or I attempt to. So you may see big differences in the adapted version versus the natural version. And all this really says is, I think there's either too much or too little of this type of behavior, and I'm trying to add or subtract it. I'm trying to be more or less of it. And that's just dictated by which way the score goes between natural and adapted. So a person who's a high D in the natural and adaptive becomes a low D, then you have a person who, is trying to say, well, maybe I'm too assertive. Maybe I'm too aggressive. I feel I'm too dominating or decisive, and I need to slow it down. Someone moving from a low D to a high D, well, I'm not. It's the opposite. I'm not decisive enough. I'm too slow. Maybe I need to be more aggressive. Maybe I need to speak out. State my opinion, stand my ground. Eyes, it's all the same. All you need to do is understand what it is to be a high or a low I, and you're really describing to that individual moving from one to the other. So the high I becoming a low I and adapted, I'm too emotional. I talk too much. I share too much. I'm overselling my ideas, everybody keeps telling me. And their adapted I is very low. And so what they're saying is, I need to be quieter and more reserved. Sit back, shut up, and listen twice as much as I speak. And vice versa. The low I moving to the high I, get out of your shell. Stop being a wallflower. Be more talkative or more emotional. Share opinions. Interact with others. Be more aggressive or assertive or outgoing. S's again and C's, we won't belabor the point, but the high S moving to low S, I need to hurry up. I need to move more quickly. Low S to high S, from natural to adapted, I need to slow down. I'm so impatient and impetuous, I just rush into things. I need to probably slow down. And the C's up and down. High C lowers the C because they're getting the impression, overtly or covertly, that they're too accurate, too detail-oriented, too pedantic, too anal retentive. Low C moving to high C, not the opposite. I'm the exact opposite. I feel my perception is that I should be have more of these. We don't worry about the degree of change until it reaches about 30 points. That's the zone where I do worry that there's some stress being induced, because adapting your behavior is stressful, physically and emotionally. It literally physically drains you to make a 30 or more point adaptation all day long. So whenever we see adaptation, my biggest interest is, why does that person think they need to make this change, which is my question to them, because they live there every day. It's the best indicator I have as a consultant or a coach or a leader that they're perceiving something is wrong. Again, bear in mind, adaptation is the sum of my perception between results and behavior. If results are great, I'm not going to find somebody who's trying to change anything. You don't go move a physical object if it's in the exact right location. You don't change position if you're perfectly comfortable and sitting where you should be. Whenever you see somebody changing, it's because where they were was no longer where they felt they needed to be. Performance has gone down, and they're tying it here. So it's a great early indicator, before I know anything about the person, their environment, or results, that they think something they're doing is causing a problem in the results. And so I know that's where I'm going to dig. I will ask, why do you feel the need to modify your behavior in this way? After I explain it, you feel you need to be much more of this or much less of that. Why is that? What results are you seeing that's driving your attempts to change the way you behave? And it's the easiest way to start my coaching or debriefing sessions, because they can take the last 5 years they've been in the job and distill it down to a single answer of, well, everybody keeps telling me I'm too detail-oriented and I need to let go. And then I can explore from there. That's the DISC theory. And so it really is that simple, understanding each of the four. The profiles are written to give you everything you need, so there's not any complicated matrices or formulas or learning of 40,000 different kinds of patterns. The report will do a very good job of telling you exactly what all four of their scores mean when considered together. So all you really have to do, in its simplest definition, is read through the report. Having a good, solid understanding of what each of the four dimensions are allows you to explain what the report says and why it says it. The other side to the equation is not how people prefer to behave, but why why they do the things they do. Not how they do them behaviorally, but what motivates me. This is on a deeper level. Where are my passions? Where are my motivations? Okay? Two Ds might be behaving the same in a room or any given role, but one's there for personal benefit, gain, financial reward. The other's there because they love helping people. Now, what they do in the job and how they do it is very similar, but their reasons for being there, the why, WHY, the why behind their being there is very different, and that can make a huge difference in engagement, in performance, in satisfaction with the job. Number one problem with somebody who's not engaged, disengaged, the descriptions you normally see from a symptomatic side are, Johnny does the bare minimum. He just does what he needs to get by. We can't really get him excited. Increased turnover, where people last a certain period of time and then leave. Many times, number one reason, poor relationship with their manager. Number two reason, because there was no connection between why they want to do things and what the job was offering them. So we look at the work of Dr. Edward Spronger, and a book he wrote back in 1914 and came to America in 28 called Universal Theory of Motivation and Drivers, or that's the name of his work, sorry. What he did was looked at a whole lot of people and basically assessed what motivated them. And then he did some regression analysis and looked at, of what they said, because everybody had their own different way of saying it, could we back that down to a single list of core categories? So millions of words might have been used as to what motivates me and the way an individual described it. But in the end, they ended up fitting into one of 7 big boxes. We'll skip the science. There were originally 6, and then, Vernon Alport and Lindsay ended up expanding that by 1. So we are unique in the marketplace here at Intermetrics in that we measure 7. The only other motivational profile I've seen based on Spronger and Alport's work where he looks at 6. I don't think they're incorporating Alport's work. So no matter who you are, no matter where in the world you live, if you are a human, you have some degree of motivation in all 7 of these core areas, but we're going to be interested in which are the highest. And that's normally 1 or 2. Sometimes a third comes in close, just numerically on a 0 to 100 scale. But it's understanding what drives and motivates me that makes my engagement go through the roof. The people that you know who say, I've never had a job, I love what I do, they're the people who their role magically has fit, whether they've done it intentionally or not, and it's different on who you talk to. Their role is the optimal fit for satisfying their greatest motivations. They're passionate about what they do. So those 7 dimensions are the aesthetic. And these are people that are driven, they're motivated to achieve harmony and form over functions, not the practical functionality. It's the form of how it works, how beautifully it works, how elegantly it works. Physical beauty and the environment and the clothes, the car can definitely be a motivation of the high aesthetic. But it doesn't have to be. The bohemian sort of attitude is very much an aesthetic attitude. The harmony, they don't have to have beautiful, expensive watches and clothes and cars, but there's a harmony and a balance to it. And environmental initiatives, environmentally friendly green initiatives are usually very motivational to high aesthetics as well. It could be coming out in the form of art or music, some sort of artistic talent. But again, you may not be able to hold a note to save your life or paint a circle, but you can still be a high aesthetic. There's just different ways that you're motivated and satisfying that motivation. The economic dimension, there may be another person who they wake up in the morning seeking, and it's not just money. Spronger used economic, and I think it still fits because it's the easiest way to monitor what motivates this person. But what really motivates them is increasing returns, building a better and increasing the ROI, return on investment, improving results and maximizing gains. So going out tomorrow and turning 2 into 4, whether that's $2 into $4, whether that's 2 employees into 4 employees, whether that's 2 clients into 4 clients, whatever my principal focus is, I want to increase value every day. That's what excites me. So having clear, tangible lines showing that high economic, the results of their work are very important and motivational to them. The individualistic is the person who's mostly motivated for freedom and independence. They want to be autonomous, they want to be unique and do their own thing. There's the high political. Their drive is not politics per se as we see it now in the 2000s, but to have influence, to lead, to have authority and be in control and achieve some certain power. The high social is a person who's all about serving and helping others, altruistic thoughts. The regulatory is somebody who wants to make sure that they're regulating. They're motivated to create regulations, follow regulations, be very traditional in how things are done because that's a very structured, orderly, routine way of doing things. It's not behaviors. They don't maybe behave like a high S, you might be thinking when it comes to regulatory. That's how they're going to go about it, but why are they there? And their inspiration and their passion is for going out and finding traditions and finding things and protecting the status quo. And lastly, the theoretical. What motivates this individual is to achieve knowledge, to learn for knowledge's sake, or for knowledge for knowledge's sake. They simply want to continually understand. So in your values index profile, you'll see the opening page has all 7 of these, and it's the individual score for each of the 7 for that one person. The little squares that are hovering over them with a thicker line in the middle represent the norm for the world population. Okay? Predominantly North American based, but statistically enough global participation that we haven't seen any statistically significant differences in any of the other countries we've gone to yet. So this is really a global pattern. Middle line is the norm. Top of that little gray box is 1 standard deviation above the norm. Bottom of the box is 1 standard deviation below. Each has its own color, and you're going to see the scores because, again, we have, like DISC, a score in all 7. Mathematically and from the science side, it's not possible to have a 0. There is some degree of motivation, but I'm going to be most interested while interpreting this in at least the highest, possibly the highest 2, and on rare occasion, if there's a tie for first or second, I might be looking at all 3. But I'm not going to learn a whole lot by looking at the negative side of it. There's those that argue it's important, and it's in the report, and if we need to connect what doesn't motivate a person, we can do that. But I personally believe that to spend a lot of time educating somebody on what they're not motivated by doesn't return a whole lot. Now, I'm a high economic, so for me, the investment of my time, I'm motivated to make sure that I'm maximizing my gains. And perhaps that's why I think this way. But I haven't seen any of the thousands of consultants that we've worked with around the world receive a ton of benefit focusing on demotivations. Do not motivate me this way. Okay, possibly some would argue it helps me avoid trying to communicate that way. But we're not talking about communication. We understand from the high aesthetic that they need to be connecting whatever it is they're doing with either how it's creating harmony for them, others, or the world, how it's the form that takes precedence over the function. Sure, we could build this thing and snap it together and get it out the door tomorrow. It would be ugly, but if you closed your eyes, you wouldn't tell that it wasn't working as well as the next. They don't like that. They'd rather take something that doesn't perform quite as well as the competitive product, but looks 10 times better, is much more beautiful or aesthetically pleasing. They like balance. So balance in work and life. The work-life balance everybody always talks about. Very important to the high aesthetic. A super high, 80 and above aesthetic, not likely to be somebody who's a terrible workaholic. It doesn't directly cause it or not cause it, but it would block it. Working 100 hours a week doesn't work for the super high aesthetic because that's not good work-life balance. And conversely, it doesn't cause workaholic problems if you have a 10 aesthetic, but it removes any barriers to it. So if a person needs to work or chooses to work 100 hours a week, or whatever workaholic would be in your world, there's no aesthetic reason that they're not worried about that. They're going to be worried about that because it doesn't, balance doesn't factor in. If you're talking to the economic, what motivates the economic is practical returns. It's the utilitarian kind of aspects. They'll argue with the aesthetic, shut up and get it out the door. We don't need to polish it, put fancy paint and covers on it. It works. Nobody's going to see it. They don't care if they're the high aesthetic, and they will irritate the high economic and vice versa, because they're kind of polar opposites with that one regard to form versus function. The former wants the form, the latter here, and the economic wants the function. And that's all that matters. It's efficiency. Okay? It's the production assets and value, maximizing of gains, and in the end, pure practical results. That's all that matters. So economic term belabors, the financial monetary tone a little bit too much, in my opinion. But it is the easiest way for that economic to know, to clearly see the results of their work, because they're not motivated to put in work and effort and invest their time, ROI, investing my time and effort, without seeing clearly, demonstrably, the results. And most of these things really come into play when I'm hiring or understanding why somebody's not engaged. So hire a high economic, put them in a role that says no matter what you do, no matter how hard you work, you're always going to just make this salary. It's not going to motivate a high economic. It's going to frustrate the hell out of them, to be honest with you, because why would I want to be excited about a job where the harder I work, nothing changes? I mean, people might respect me more, but I'm not seeing a direct benefit. The individualistic must connect the autonomy with the objective. How does this objective reinforce their desire, their passion to be free, to be an individual, to do their own thing? Okay? They want to be relevant to themselves, so how do they stand apart? They want to be able to customize something. They don't like being told to do everything like everybody else, working for the archetypal kind of IBM in the 80s days. Everybody wear the same suit and color shoes, stand in line behind the guy, and keep your head behind the line in front of you. It doesn't motivate, and you will not find superior engagement from a high individualistic in that role. The political is somebody whose main drive is to lead, so you have to be able to connect what you're wanting them to do, or they have to be able to connect what they're doing to being established as an authority, or improving their leadership ability or position to actually become a leader, or get promoted into leadership, or on the track to head that way at best. And they like being competitive. There's a motivation for competition in here that's higher than the others in many regards, because it's a race about me and you, not I want to be competitive to win more from an economic standpoint. I want to be competitive because I know more than you. There's some competitive motivation in a lot of these, but this one is much more directly related to I want to be in front because I want to lead. I want to be the person who's being followed. Put a person in this role, in a role that has no leadership authority, no management abilities, not guiding or leading anybody, not an expert in anything, and they're not going to be engaged or satisfied or passionate. Of course, conversely, take somebody who's a 10 here and say, we need you to be the new leader, and that doesn't motivate them at all. If you can connect what that role is to other motivations, great, they can be equally as engaged. But don't entice them with excitement for the job by saying, you'll be in charge. The aesthetic, the altruistic, all about helping people. They must connect what they're doing with how they're helping the world, helping people, satisfying the needs of others, giving, selflessly, being compassionate. The regulatory has to have connection with a job or an objective or goals or tasks that are either defining rules and regulations, reinforcing rules and regulations, creating systems and order out of chaos. That's what excites them. So put them in a job where their main objective is to destroy a traditional way of doing something, where they're to rebel the counterculture way of doing it. They are not going to be excited. And lastly, the traditional or theoretical. This is a person who will get bored with any role faster than any of the others. If theoretical is the highest for any individual employee, individual in general, they have to have a constantly slanting, growing learning curve. Put them in a job and say 3 months in, 6 months in, you've learned everything you need to do, you're good. Now just keep repeating. And that begins the decline of their excitement for the job. And it won't last much longer before they either leave physically or leave in their mind and just forget to tell you, depending on circumstances. So you have here the need, the passion, the desire to continually learn, and you must satisfy that in their role. They must. And as management, if you're hiring them or promoting them or leading them, you must make sure you're always connecting with their greatest passion. Doing it a couple of times a year isn't going to work. So that's the DISC and the values index. How and why, respectively. There's some other profiles that we invite you to check out by just going to intermetrics.com, and you'll be able to learn a little bit more about some of the other profiles as well. And they flesh out the understanding even more. The attribute index would go as the third component and go deeper into more of a coaching kind of relationship. You really only get the attribute index when you're getting into deep coaching or foundational work. The Advanced Insights combines those three. So an Advanced Insights is basically an A, a D, and a V, an attributes index, a DISC index, and a values index, just packaged into a single bundle. So it's one report, one instrument. And then there's the health check series with the organizational health check. Here we're measuring an organization, not an individual. So it's a group report. Multiple individuals in an organization answer an online survey. All of these are online. And this program aggregates their input and presents it graphically and numerically in a report that allows me to understand the opinions of all of those in my organization who are driving management and culture, operations, sales and marketing, customer service, strategic planning, leadership, team effectiveness, personnel, as well as personal, each individual's overall opinion on their own satisfaction with the organization. And lastly, employee alignment. Now we have multiple versions inside the health checkup. The OHC, the organizational health check, is the one that looks at 11, and that's the one that we'll talk about first when you get there to Intermetrics, but we have customization capabilities as well. So there's a variety of other ways that you can start understanding individuals beyond just the DISC and the values. And, we welcome you to come check them out. And dig into the profiles, get to know them, and if you have any questions, contact your customer support person with Intermetrics. Thanks.